to provide policy guidance on allowing affordable housing on GU zone property. For that, we have Matt Osterhout.
Good morning, Chair, Commissioners.
Morning.
For the record, Matt Osterhout, Director of Plan and Development Services. And yes, today our topic is affordable housing in GU. This stems from a conversation back from the board earlier this year in March. We requested an update report on a Unified Development Code text amendment, UDC text amendment regarding GU zone property. We provided that report back in April earlier this year, and then we scheduled this discussion for the policy discussion to receive your guidance on next steps. A little bit of background. So you see on the screen the GU district, what it applies to, but more importantly, for purposes of today's conversation, are the two bottom bullets. These are the current permitted uses in GU, as well as the special exception uses in GU. So as you read through that, you can certainly see that, yes, a UDC text amendment would be needed to advance the topic of affordable housing in GU zone property. So permitted uses in GU do not currently allow residential as a primary use. You can look at the third bullet there. That's typically what you might see from a residential standard where you might have a caretaker for a university or so forth. Some of the things that our staff looked at when we evaluated this board assignment and provided you the report was we had some questions about how it might work, right? Ultimately, GU is intended to be owned by Sarasota County or another government entity, and these types of issues may come up as we start to look at an actual project, such as what are those current and planned uses for that government zone property? What type of affordable housing are we looking at? Is it 100% AMI? Is it 60% AMI? And if you go down the list, you can kind of see some of the other things. Are we intended to stay as the owner of the land, or are we intending to sell that land a little bit later? If we're going to intend to own it, then you'd have to talk about what types of liability, upkeep, who does the maintenance, and really work through those specifics. Now, a couple of things that this board is very familiar with, I just wanted to point it out for the record this morning. The county has been successful using the surplus lands model. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. For all of those initiatives, those properties were not planned to have affordable housing on GU. They would receive some other zoning district to implement that land use designation. And we've done those through sale and purchase agreements. And we have two successful ones and one actually being negotiated right now. The other alternative that the board can always look at, and the board's done this in the past, if there is a very specific property that the board has in mind, we can also have a county-initiated rezoning, where we actually rezone it to the proper district and then be able to sell that property to somebody who might be an interested buyer. And so with that, that completes my presentation. I'm not familiar with the specific site the board might have in mind, so really this is just looking for your policy guidance on the topic, and you can see on the next steps, we'll advance the next steps to get the board's policy guidance moving forward. And that's it, Chair. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Matt. Any questions for Matt at this time on this? Commissioner Smith.
Matt, thank you for that presentation. Without getting too much into it, my personal feeling is that the government doesn't need to be a landlord. And so, but we look at each one of these properties individually, and I'm inclined to lean towards rezoning, public initiated rezone, to unload the property if we don't want it, or work with any one of our agencies that wants to initiate their own affordable housing program. Thanks.
Commissioner Moran.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the conversation, and our community's been having for quite some time now. But at the beginning of all of these conversations, I always like to just do a quick reminder is that memories get super, super short, I always say, is that in this community just a few short years ago, almost every single one of us on the streets that we live on, there was a house that had grass a foot tall, and you could have bought it for the lint in your pocket. We had affordable housing, we sure did. There was a whole bunch of them foreclosed on, and these things go in incredibly cyclical cycles, if you ask me. What I think is worth noting, and I think staff needs some credit on this for sure, and this is, you guys did a wonderful job. Before I got on this board, we literally didn't have a list of what we owned. I came from the Southwest Florida Water Management District, where we had a software system where, I mean, you knew if a 2-foot easement was put into a computer system. We've come a long way. Is now every single parcel that this county owns, the taxpayer owns, is in a computer system Then we went through the next phases of it, saying, well, wait a minute. If it's not a public purpose or a compelling interest for the county, why in the world do we own this? And it was put on surplus. There was a lot of work that went behind that. So we've come a long way. So now with these designations of these GUs and talking this through, we're going to be having some conversation at this board. We just had a lot of it yesterday related to where does the government step in and where does the government stay away from this with the free market. And we're going to be having that conversation related to housing, not shelter, not Salvation Army shelter, but housing and paying for rent, subsidizing rent. These are deep societal conversations I think we need to have, but specific to whether if the taxpayer owns it, I don't care what it's zoned. As you mentioned, Matt, we can zone it whatever we want and put it back on the free market if we think there's a compelling interest in the interest of the taxpayers. But Chair, I really think it's a great idea. I'm not suggesting it's not. I just, actually, it's dovetailing nicely with the conversations we had yesterday, frankly. But that's just for discussion. I'm listening very much.
Well, I think the action would be to, excuse me, I think the action would be to bring it back as a publicly initiated UDC text amendment. Would that be the action that we would be considering? The question I have is, I understand the obstacles here. You know, one thing I can say, we set the bar on being creative here in Sarasota County to how to, you know, as many different ways to provide affordable housing as possible, just across the board. And I think, you know, I've had neighboring communities say, well, we're looking at you to kind of create our model for it. So I'm very proud of that. I'm not sure that there's a downside to moving this forward because I know we don't, I understand that, you know, and I read through the list and I understand there's significant issues to address. But if we were to go through the process and decide, well, it really, you know, it's not something possible, I don't see the downside to that. It's a possible tool in the toolbox. Now, again, I am not interested in the county owning and maintaining and being a landlord, but maybe there's an option here that wouldn't necessarily be the case, and there would be some way for us to, you know, partner or have someone else, you know, a group come in and we've done those kinds of things. I don't know what it would lead to, but I'm still interested in having a conversation. So I'd be in favor of moving this forward again, just as a matter of bringing it forward for a public hearing, getting, you know, public testimony from organizations, and just understanding if there is any possibility. Just another tool in the toolbox. So that's my thoughts, Commissioner Rainford.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the debate here. You know, I think it sounded like, if maybe I didn't hear it correctly, but that most of the commissioners that spoke already said that they're not in favor of the government, you know, being a landowner, and I think we have to be cautious when we get to in a potential amendment or something with, you know, county-owned current property, that we're not encumbering it, restricting it for potential uses in the future where there might be more government involved. So I think that I'm under the thought of, you know, if we want to rezone something, a particular parcel, and we have a, you know, private entity that wants to come in and, you know, make housing affordable, just like they did on Beneva, the example that I've shared before, and where we enable the density that makes the numbers work in terms of making housing affordable, then I think the private sector will step up to that. Like Commissioner Moran said, this is very cyclical. You know, we're in a spot now where costs are high, and, you know, that you know, ebb and flow might flow backwards here at some point as well.
Commissioner Nunder?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Matt, appreciate your time. I think this will prove to be a very good academic exercise on your end, and to be able to bring this board back with any and all options that are viable for the community. However, you know, from my personal perspective, I also mimic comments from my colleagues on the board. I don't know that we want to be in the land-owning rental business, but certainly as a matter of academic discipline and something to work through, I think it's going to be a good exercise to kind of see exactly what all the options on the table could be.
Yeah, Chair, if I may, going back to this list right here, I think there might be some board policy guidance we also might want to work out today if the board is going to say advance a UDC text amendment. Otherwise, staff might be creating some criteria on our own and getting it back to you all at a later date. We might miss that mark. For example, you can see on this list here, I have heard some comments about that the county would not be a landlord, for instance. But if you look at the second criteria, the affordable housing criteria, what type of affordable housing might the board be looking at so that as we're, oh, they can't see our screen? Yeah, sorry. Oh, I can pause for a second too if that helps. There we go. So this is just simply that list that I referenced earlier. These are some of the things that as were going to craft Unified Development Code text amendment language, we would need some guidance on. If I can just walk through them. The first one is more of an exercise of when we get to a specific property, right? We have to look at the current and planned government uses for that site. We wouldn't need that per se for the text amendment. The second one, we would need to know the board's policy guidance on, are we looking at a certain type of professional, a certain AMI, 100%, 80%, 120. I don't know what that looks like. When you get down to a little bit of the bottom, you see the zoning standards and compatibility. When you look at other residential zoning districts, they have specific requirements for things like lot size, setback, height, all of those. So there might be another zoning district that you all want to mimic, and then we can incorporate those types of things. And then as you go down to the bottom, there are some other factors, and I think the upkeep and maintenance might fall underneath some of those comments from the board earlier about not being a landlord. But we'd still have to figure out then how does that work? If it's zone GU and it's supposed to be for government use, you're still going to have some sort of legal agreement to be the owner and having somebody else occupying the property. So those are some of the things that staff have been working on, and just if you have any policy guidance right now, that would be great. One thing that we also will have to evaluate is whether or not a comprehensive plan amendment may be required. We'd have to take a look at what's in the comprehensive plan as it defines GU as an implementing district, and then be able to see whether or not that needs to be also edited, modified to be able to implement a UDC text amendment. We can certainly come back at a later date as we kind of chew on this a little bit and bring back some board options as I was hearing. But I also just wanted to highlight this slide right here, some things this is where staff is needing some guidance.
Okay, well, I'm listening. I hear the board, and if this is a hurdle too high to jump over, then that's what the board is kind of saying here. Then I'm not necessarily going to say I'm going to have to make a motion on this, but I'm just looking to expand whatever opportunities we have, and if the board feels comfortable that we can simply just rezone a property and not do the GU. The question I had was, sometimes in these situations, a lot of times going through that process presents a lot of challenges, and we have lands that are available that are zone GU, and there's an opportunity to do something, again, but not putting us in ownership of the project or management of the project. That seemed like it might be an opportunity to at least explore. Kind of hearing here that maybe there's too many obstacles to that. I'm not sure. Commissioner Ring.
I'd be open to exploring the residential densities in a GU. I don't know that we need an amendment or any further guidance from staff, in my opinion, other than saying, at what point does the private sector look to these potential lots to build, whether that's half dwelling units or not. But I don't think I personally don't think we need a text amendment.
Okay, well, I'll look to the board here. Any further discussion, thoughts on this? Any, Commissioner Moran, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to get back to center here for a minute. So, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, just for conceptual discussion for a minute. So, when we put the Excel spreadsheet together of all the properties we own, it's my understanding you went department head by department head and said, listen, you better explain why you bought this property. In the past, it might have been an employee that's not even there. It might have been somebody that was there years and years and years ago, decades ago. Your department heads had to justify why in the world the taxpayer owns this property. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, if I may, it went that and one step further. So every property that the county owns was put into categories. We needed it, what the specific reason was. We didn't need it, and it either is already surplus or it needed to go to surplus, which I think we've sold close to about 300 properties since then. Of course, 200 of those were the lots down in Northport, give or take. Matt's saying my number's wrong, but it is one. You can correct me. It's okay. It's north of that anyway. He's saying I didn't give a big enough number, is what he's saying. And then there were ones that had legal entanglements. There were the little 2-foot easements that you mentioned that it's almost impossible to get rid of. So we've gone through all that. We've now been able to narrow that down a little bit. We don't need the 5 categories anymore because we have so many. And by administrative policy, every single property is reviewed on a departmental rotation in a cycle, and Matt's actually recommended me to reduce that. We were doing spread out the departments over a 5-year period. Matt thinks we can do it more efficiently over a shorter period of time. So now that is an ongoing process. We also have it up under our property management website under Planning and Development Services, where people can look at the properties that we have out there and come back to us with ideas. And certainly we had one not too long ago off on Array where local opportunity came forward and they offered to buy the piece of property from me and did so because of that land review, and that information is out there and publicly accessible.
So, Chair, if I could, so I think we need to celebrate that for a minute. So think about that. We took that property and said, wait a minute, if we don't have a long-term plan for this, or somebody has a vision for it, or maybe the vision changed, whatever, is get it back on the tax rolls, get it back to the private sector. What in the world are we hanging on to it for? If I'm understanding you, Matt, then you're saying the first bullet point was like, listen, you're saying we're pulling it off that list, saying it didn't have a purpose. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So that first bullet point you had on the guidance was current and planned government uses. Is you're like, we're sure we don't want it. Is that what you're asking on that bullet point?
That is, once we look at a specific site, if it doesn't have a current or planned government use, we would bring that forward to surplus
Got
the
it.
property to you.
So it's part of that category that Jonathan just
That is correct.
perfectly described, in my opinion.
That is correct.
Listen, if it doesn't have a government purpose, hey, maybe this is an idea for it. I think the number 2 bullet is where you will have a lot of discussion from this board, I hope, literally related to the conversation we had yesterday, is what does that mean?
What does that mean?
And getting real deep into what that means. Me personally, I want to see a specific example. And I mean all the way through specific example. Was it a public-private partnership vision? Was it us dealing with it? What if it is a public-private partnership, what restrictions we put on that private entity to make this happen? Doing what-if scenarios if, let's say, this doesn't work out so well in the economy is 6 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, you have 30% vacancy. What does that mean to the financial statement? I think that's an honest, solid, fiscally conservative view of how to deal with this, rather than these massive broad brushes since I've been here of talking about affordable housing. How's that working out is what I would say. I'm much more interested in getting to the granular detail of what that would mean and what the vision would be like. But with that, I'll give you the other side of it is this would come back as a UDC amendment, publicly initiated is my understanding,
Yep.
which is at that point it gives public input. There's a public input process to that for people to challenge the goods and bads of that. Is that a fair summary?
That is fair.
Okay, so Chair, that's my 2 cents on this.
Can I just jump in on that? Matt, you listed some of the things you'd need for us if we were, some of the criteria that we would have to really consider. Could you put that in a memo and kind of get that back to us so that we could look at what it would take, some of those things that would be raised as an issue before we make a decision on this? I've spoken to some folks who are saying, maybe they would create some housing because they're having such a problem hiring employees, even in the municipal and public sector, that they're considering things like even doing some housing, which would be part of their contract with someone to bring them here, and they would get a year or 2 in that affordable housing unit that was provided so that they could then get their feet on the ground, and then as they move up and they move on, they can move into another area or whatever. But that might happen on one of the organization's GU zone lands. I don't know if that would or not, but it just seems to me it's worth exploring. So if you could, would that be okay that we could have you come back with kind of a set of criteria that we would really need to discuss before we could have a good idea on moving it forward?
We've done something similar to that, Chair, in the past
Okay.
with other policy matters.
Okay.
Bring you back some substance and say, did we get it right
Okay.
before we actually start writing code language?
Sure.
So that we don't get it wrong and then get too far down that process. So that might be the next interim step, is to put a little bit more meat on these bones and say, is this what you're all thinking?
And that might be a safe jump-off spot, Chair. without spending a whole lot of staff time if the board ultimately doesn't want to do it. It's a good way to frame it up, so that if you all as a board choose not to pursue it, it's not, it's an investment of time, but it's not a crazy investment of time.
So just need a consensus on that? Do you need a motion? No, okay, so we have a consensus on that? All right,
Thank
with
you, Chair.
that, thank you, Matt.
Yep.
Appreciate it.